Well, welcome everyone. Kia ora. My name is Andrea, and I will start us off with a whakatauki. The one I chose today goes like this. He ehara takutoa I te toa takitahi he toa takitini. And it means my success is not mine alone, but it is the strength of many. And I think it's a really appropriate whakatauki for today's webinar. We are going to answer the question about or if a budget for equality and the climate needs less spending by government or more. So welcome everyone for joining us today. This webinar is part of a mini webinar series we are doing before the budget, including one webinar we are doing after the budget. So wonderful to have you all here. Some of you might have joined us yesterday already. We had a great discussion with Craig Rennie from the CTU and Bernard Hickey about how a budget would look like if it delivered for working people. And we recorded the session, so you can find it on our website, but also on Facebook very shortly. And the same is true for this webinar, so you will find it afterwards on our website and on Facebook. And please, if you enjoyed the webinar, share it with your colleagues, with whānau, and of course, keep discussing the budget until it will be announced on the 19th of May, which is next Thursday. And surely it will stimulate a lot of discussion afterwards, depending on who is winning and who is missing out in the budget. So today we have Max Rashbrooke with us. Many of you know Max. He has joined us for previous webinars as well, and he is a journalist, an academic, but also an author. His recent book is entitled Too Much Money: How Wealth Disparities Are Unbalancing Aotearoa. And he also has a very extensive website, so please do check it out. He also has a newsletter you can subscribe to, and I really recommend all his work. He's very interested in economic inequality and democratic renewal, so you're perfectly placed, Max, to discuss our question for the webinar today: a budget for equality and the climate. Is now the time for government to stop spending? A slightly provocative question, but I'm sure you have lots to tell us in relation to that question, and maybe also some answers. How are we running the webinar today? We are doing it in a very similar way to all the other webinars before. You're absolutely welcome to share your comments and ideas in the chat. And please use the question and answer function for your questions. And please keep your questions rather short and succinct. Makes it easier for us to bring them into the conversation. So please use the question and answer function for your questions. We will have Max giving us a bit of an introduction into his thoughts and ideas in relation to the budget and the investment needed to decrease inequality and to deal with the climate change issue. And after that, we'll have your questions. I also have a few questions noted down here, but we'll just have a bit of a conversation after Max has finished his presentation. And then we'll close at 1:15. So please, welcome Max Rashbrooke to our talk today. I think Max, I think I'll just hand over to you, and I think you brought a presentation for us today as well.
Yes, that's right, I have. Well, kia ora koutou. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here virtually. Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction. Yes, and I will just start my presentation. And the looking at the title, this is the short title up here, but the long title with its question mark at the end reminds me very much of the rule about newspaper headlines that you get taught as a journalist, which is that if there's a question, if the headline is in the form of a question, the answer is always no. You know, this season, is brown the new black? No. Have we found a cure for cancer? No. And so, spoiler alert, this talk is the same principle. Is now the time to stop spending? No. I can tell you that right up the top of things. What I've got is a few slides, a few graphs, which hopefully tell a bit of a story about economic inequality and climate change. I should stress that I'm really an expert more on the former, that on the latter, my interest in climate change is mostly around the economic inequality dimensions of it. There's quite a lot of data in the graphs that follow, but really in each of them, just a couple of sort of key things to pick out, which I'll talk to, but don't worry too much about sort of every last nth detail. And I'm going to run through it relatively quickly because I want to leave lots of time for questions, bearing in mind I've only got 45 minutes or so. So the first point around, you know, what the budget might do in terms of addressing inequality and the climate is just to think about, you know, where we are and where we've come from. And this is a graph that some of you may have seen before. It's looking at, you know, since the 1980s and adjusting for inflation, what has happened to the incomes of 4 typical people in New Zealand. And what you see very quickly is that over that long period of time, people in the poorest 10th of the country, that's the bottom line, and even people in the middle have been doing very badly. We have built an economic model where the benefits of growth largely bypass a huge swathe of New Zealand. You know, those two groups have only seen their incomes after tax increase, you know, maybe 30, 40% over a very long period of time. In contrast, the income of the typical person in the richest 10% of the country has seen their incomes double. And for someone in the richest 1% of the country, where you have to look at their pre-tax income for complicated data reasons, that has also more than doubled. So, yeah, we've built a very...
Max, sorry for interrupting. We can't see your slides moving along. We can only see your title slide. Could you maybe move that along?
Well,
or put it into slide mode, maybe, because
it is in slide mode.
Okay.
Excuse me, Max. You're probably sharing the wrong screen. Try to.
There we go.
Redo the share screen and choose the.
Right.
Can
you see the graph now?
Inequality of income, yeah?
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay,
sorry about that.
That's the opposite way around to how it should work. But anyway, we'll go with that. So a very significant inequality of income. And on top of that, also very significant inequality of carbon emissions. This is some new data from the World Inequality Database, which and the red line at the top is the carbon footprint of someone in the top 10% of New Zealand, and you can see that that's 3 times the carbon footprint. So not only do we have a general climate change problem with excessive emissions, we also have a problem that specifically that's being created disproportionately by people in the top 10%. Now, in terms of what the government has done so far to address that, well, I think we all know the story on climate change, some important structural moves with the Zero Carbon Act and things of that nature, but emissions themselves are not yet coming down, so there's a lot of work to be done there. On issues to do with inequality and poverty, so many ways to talk about it, but this is one. This is a graph sort of showing you all the core benefits, and the acronyms are on the side. This is domestic purposes, employment benefit, and their modern names, sole parent support, supported living payment, job seeker support. What's important in sort of all the data on this graph is that what we're looking at here is each of those benefits as a proportion of the average wage. So this is really measuring what are the living standards of beneficiaries, to what extent are they staying in touch with those of average New Zealanders. And what you see, of course, is a very sharp fall in benefits in 1991, the mother of all budgets, but then also a continued decline, including right through the period of the fifth Labour government. And that's because benefits were only indexed to inflation, and normally, although not at the moment, that is much lower than wages. So the big story of the last 30 years is beneficiaries' living standards falling further and further behind those of people who are in full-time paid work, people who are on the average wage. So a real, an increase in that disparity. And what this graph also shows you is what this government has done. And you can really see that two stories are true at once. The increases in core benefits that this government has delivered are actually quite steep. Those lines are ticking very sharply upwards. The core benefit is $100 a week, more or less more than it was when Labour took power in 2017, which is a very significant increase. However, there is still a mountain to climb in terms of getting those benefit rates back to where they were pre-Ruth Richardson, back to a point where beneficiaries can enjoy a standard of living that is at least comparable to those that other people can enjoy, and so they can live in dignity. So there's still huge spending needs facing us in this budget, and frankly a lot of budgets to come. The question that of course is being raised is, well, in addressing those kinds of issues, is the government going to just simply make things worse by driving up inflation, by adding more money to the pot of money that is chasing things, and therefore increasing the cost of all the things that are out there in the economy? And I would suggest that story is false. I know you've just had a webinar with Craig Rennie, who was responsible for this graph, so he may or may not have talked about it. It is looking at a range of countries and their government spending as a percentage of GDP. That's the bar on the left. Then measuring that against a couple of other things, one of which is economic growth. You can actually disregard that for the purpose of this conversation. That's the black bar, but also the grey bar in the middle, which is CPI or inflation. Again, there's a welter of information in this graph, but the key thing to pull out of it is just that there is essentially no connection between those first two bars. Countries with much greater spending, much greater response to COVID, much greater government spending response, have not seen higher inflation. So it does not appear to suggest that government spending is what is responsible for the current rate of inflation that New Zealand is experiencing, which in fact is largely imported. It's not the government's fault that the cost of getting a shipping container here from Shanghai has doubled compared to 2020. It's not the government's fault that there's a war in Ukraine. So by and large, inflation is imported. Very little of it, I think, is directly under the government's control. However, it does have to be attentive to it in the budget for a couple of reasons. If you think about the inequality question, this is a graph of the different inflation rates experienced by different groups in New Zealand since 2008. Again, lots of data, but the most important thing to pull out of it is that the darker line at the bottom is the cumulative inflation that's been experienced by the richest New Zealanders, the highest spending group. And the line at the top of the graph is the inflation that's been experienced by the lower spending group, the poorest New Zealanders. And this is also true to a greater or lesser extent for beneficiary households, for Māori, for superannuitants. And so the very simple point that this graph is making is that there is inequality of inflation. People experience inflation differently. Inflation is greatest for the poorest New Zealanders, those who are least able to afford it. And that is because they spend all their household budgets on things where inflation is most prominent, course, groceries compared to wealthier households. So you have an inequality of inflation, which the government has to be attentive to. And then you have the potential for climate action to impact most severely on that same group, the people who have already seen economic growth is largely bypassed in recent decades, whose incomes, particularly for beneficiaries, are still nowhere near they should be, and who are experiencing higher inflation. So there's a triple whammy there already. That could become a quadruple whammy if we do climate action in a very crude sense. A couple of quotes here to make this point. Piece in Newsroom last year cited research that if we just put the price of carbon up to $100 a tonne, that would have a much greater impact proportionally on the lowest income households compared to the highest income households. And a journal article from earlier this year pointing out that, of course, is because emissions intensive goods, so goods with high carbon footprints, constitute a much higher proportion of spending for lower income households. Those households also have less ability to adapt to a higher price of carbon by trying to buy lower emissions goods because they simply have fewer options, and this is particularly true for Māori. And so what this all really highlights a need for, and I want to finish on this point, is for there to be a just transition. It's a phrase that will be familiar to a lot of people in the room, I'm sure, because it's a phrase that comes out of the trade union movement to a significant extent, but simply the point that the transition to a low carbon economy has to be one that is just, that is fair, that recognizes that people will be disproportionately affected by that transition, that some people will be better able to bear the impact of that transition than others, and that above all, we have to ease the burden of that transition on the lowest income households. I have no particular insight, of course, into what's going to be in the budget, but I would hope that there is significant investment in tackling climate change, because we can't just leave it to the market. There's all sorts of investments that businesses won't and can't make. So, and also, and there are inequality problems to address, and I think those things come together. So, I would like to see the government do even more to compensate poorer households for the impacts of inflation. I mean, government can't really reduce inflation, but it can cushion the impact on the poorest households. So I would like to see continued benefit increases even above what we've already seen, possibly targeted cost of living payments, even if they're temporary payments, continued increases in wages. We also need to see a really big investment in public infrastructure, especially for tackling climate change. If the price of carbon does go up, if petrol continues to rise in price, that's not really going to create reductions in emissions, and certainly not just fair reductions in emissions if poorer households can't go and take the bus or walk and cycle instead of driving somewhere. So we need a huge investment in things like public transport. Those are the kinds of investments that will deliver a just transition. And I think we also, I don't know if we'll see this in the budget, but we also need to be thinking ahead about it. Through climate change, we need to be planning ahead for that, and helping that workforce through that transition through things like active labour market programs, as they're technically called, things like mana and mahi, retraining programs, skills programs, things that help people adapt to a changing world. And only if we make those kinds of investments will we really see a just transition. And that's the sort of thinking that I'd like to see inform the budget. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much, Max. That was a lot of information and a lot of data to digest. I was quite intrigued by the graph about the inequality of inflation. And could you talk to that a little bit more? And what is needed, or what would be needed in a budget to address that inequality of inflation, which means the different experience of inflation, I guess, for different groups of people?
Yes, it's a really good point, and hopefully you can see I've brought it up again. Well, it's hard because it's not always something that governments can address directly. Governments don't have complete control over the pricing structures that the market has. I mean, in some ways, it's something to be addressed indirectly. I think stating the obvious, if we addressed inequality of income and we had very small disparities in income, then there simply wouldn't be these differences in the first place, regardless of what was happening with inflation, quote unquote. So that's an argument, just simply another argument for tackling inequalities of income and wealth. The other thing that I think is relevant here is that inflation is greatest for the lowest income households because they spend so much of their weekly budgets on those basic things, as I mentioned. And a lot of those basic things are also sectors of the New Zealand economy where there's very limited competition. We have a chronic problem with not enough competition in this country, with monopolistic behavior, cartel-like behavior, oligopolistic behavior. And I've been disappointed, frankly, in government's reluctance to take that on, because actually I think that is something you could do that would be popular as well as fair. So the supermarket duopoly, huge amount of scrutiny on that. They're making $1 million a day in excess profit. So profit well above and beyond what they should be experiencing in a competitive market. I really think the supermarket duopoly needs to be broken up in order to bring down prices and reduce inflation for those poorest households. We also have an electricity market, which is dominated by a handful of firms, which I think are able to ward off outsiders and keep the prices of electricity higher than they should be. There's an inquiry underway into building materials, which, in some cases, we have companies that control 80–90% of markets for particular building materials. We have a banking sector that's not particularly competitive. Fuel retailing has been under the spotlight for not being sufficiently competitive. I think a really big push on increasing competition would help bring prices down in those areas that most affect those poorest households.
Mm-hmm. We have a few related questions to, inequality at large and what needs to be done in order to address it. And I think the concerns are really valid because, especially in terms of climate change, low-income families will struggle with the cost of, say, buying an electric car or making different choices that are more environmentally friendly, but often more expensive. And then another question relates to the rising cost of living that you talked about. So what would be needed in order to support those families to make the right choices, for example, in terms of the climate? Does it only need individual investment, or is this actually a collective question that we need to address?
I think it's very much a collective question. Sometimes in this space, you get into questions about individual carbon budgets. But I find it very striking that that was a concept that was popularized, well, it was heavily supported by the fossil fuel industry, for instance, because it reframed everything as a question for the individual, as a question of individual responsibility. No, I think there are some people who should take individual responsibility for their emissions, but it's predominantly the wealthy, because their emissions are so huge and they genuinely have options to change them. And they are the people who, at the very bare minimum, should be buying electric vehicles, and increasingly will be. But mostly, it's a collective question. It's about the collective investments that we make in our future. It's about deciding what kind of future do we want to live in, what kind of economy do we want to have. And we want one that delivers lower emissions, but is fair to everyone. Someone's just said in the chat, the rich always seem to have utes. Well, I mean, yes, that's true to a point. Mind you, they are also buying increasingly large numbers of Teslas, I would say. I see on the streets of Wellington, really a massive increase in the number of Teslas, which are extremely expensive cars. But up to a point, that's fine, because that's creating a market, it's building a market, that's creating pressure for there to be more EV charging stations, which ultimately will benefit everyone. Those very expensive EVs will eventually be sold in a secondary market. So if there is a positive role for well-off people in this debate, it is being the early consumers of things when they're expensive, and in the long run, that'll help lower prices for everyone. But yeah, coming back to the point, it's fundamentally about collective investments. And I come back to that point about public transport. It's no good asking people to make the shift to a more environmentally friendly way of living if there isn't public transport in their area for them to take instead of the car that is convenient and reliable. And we all know about problems in Wellington with the bus network, for instance. So we have to build those collective investments up front. And we need to be making collective investments in renewable energy. We need to be making collective investments in the quality of the national grid so that it can cope with the new world of electricity generation, much of which may be distributed, people generating electricity in their own communities or even in their own households with rooftop solar and those kinds of things. It's very fundamentally about those collective investments and cushioning the impact on the poorest and most vulnerable people. So, we need to see continued increases in benefits so that they're really at a livable standard back up to somewhere where they were in the 1990s. We need to see continued increases of the minimum wage. I think fair pay agreements could be really positive in this area. More controversial, but I also think social insurance has potential to be positive because there are going to be more job losses through climate change, and it'll particularly affect lower paid workers. Payments that cushion them through that period of uncertainty and job loss will be really important. Again, I think someone in the chat has pointed out is also, public transport has its limitations, especially for the immunocompromised. So again, we need to be thinking about what are the options beyond public transport. We need to really look at the climate change issue always with an equity lens on it.
Yeah, thank you. Someone in the question and answer chat here mentioned that, or asked, what is needed? Is more competition needed, or more regulation and support? And what I'm hearing from you is more regulation and support for people rather than competition and leaving it to the market.
Yeah, although it depends where we want markets to function. They need competition within them. So I don't think there would be any merit in the government trying to run the supermarket sector. But I do think the government needs to regulate to ensure that there is actually real competition, that we have more than just two supermarket chains, because markets only work when there is competition. Yeah, as someone's just said in the chat, regulation to create competition, exactly. Markets left to themselves don't naturally always have competition, and sometimes they are, but often they tend towards monopolies with a few firms dominating, especially in a country the size of New Zealand. And we've been very relaxed about that. I think we've taken the view that, we're a small country, how many firms can you expect in any given industry? And that's just nonsense. Other small countries like Denmark will have 5 or 6 supermarket chains that are of at least noticeable size. The idea that 2 is acceptable for New Zealand, I think, is absolutely crazy. So where we want markets to work, then competition is really important. But in the bigger picture, no, I don't think climate change is solved by competition. I wrote a column the other weekend about how we can't leave climate change to the market. We can't just put a price on carbon and expect that everything will happen. There's things that only governments can do. People can't respond to price signals. They can't swap their car for a bike, unless it's actually safe to cycle, and very often in New Zealand it isn't. Competition in the market doesn't solve things like people making terrible investments right now. There's this big story in The Guardian yesterday, this is global rather than New Zealand, that the oil and gas majors have got so many projects in the pipeline, projects are already starting on, which will just absolutely blow the world's carbon budget to smithereens. They are already starting on projects that are totally and so the fact that there's already a price on carbon in a lot of these developed economies is irrelevant to them. It's not stopping them taking terrible decisions now. And the answer for that is just simple regulation, is just to close off that oil and gas exploration, say, we just literally cannot do these things if we are going to deal with climate change. It is scientifically impossible to do these things. And so again, that's not about competition, it's not about the market, it's about a collective decision to regulate something, and in the long run, regulate it out of existence.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to move on to the importance of public and community services for reducing inequality. So could you explain that link a little bit and the role that public services play in reducing inequality? Because we have heard from National End Act in particular that, you know, it's wasteful to invest in public services and that the budget should actually be cut. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think public spending can be wasteful. You know, no one sensible would deny that possibility. And I think you can look at elements of this government spending that haven't been, you know, as good as they should have been. Not that it's in national sites, but I think, you know, the wage subsidy, for instance, was absolutely a great idea up front, but there should have been a clause in it that required companies to pay it back if it proved that they didn't actually qualify. You know, so I think there's definitely some billions of dollars spent there that were unnecessary and very different to how, you know, people on welfare are treated. So there's certainly always problems you can point out. But no, in the bigger picture, public services are absolutely essential to, you know, to the good functioning of the economy and to supporting good lives. The international evidence says, contrary to sort of 30 or 40 years of neoclassical dogma, that redistribution, at least up to a point, is good for economic growth. I mean, you know, economic growth obviously to the extent that it's environmentally sustainable, and that's another debate. But, you know, if you invest in people, if you ensure that everyone's being brought up in a house that's warm and dry, that isn't making them sick, and where they're not overcrowded and they've got room in which to study, you know, as children, then they're going to do much better at school and they're going to be much more productive members of the workforce later on. Similarly, if there's a healthcare system that, you know, they can access when they need and they can get the treatment they need regardless of ability to pay. You know, I think it's crazy that it costs to see a GP here in the way that it doesn't in the UK. It's this enormous barrier to people getting the treatment they need, and we pay for that all collectively in the long run. So these services like health and education are absolutely essential to the good functioning of the economy that everyone benefits from, and they're essential for addressing inequality as well, particularly the health system. I think, you know, so many people are living in poverty or in poor health. They can't, even though, you know, healthcare is subsidised in New Zealand and there's a community services card, you know, you still pay anywhere between $10 to $20, even if you're poor, to go and see your GP often. And that's something people just can't afford. And they can't afford the transport costs to get to their GP. So investment in public services isn't wasteful. It's actually an investment in our shared prosperity.
Mm-hmm. Someone has brought up the issue around tax as well. And, you know, we need to make, obviously, a lot of investment in terms of reducing, or in order to reduce inequality and deal with the climate changes at hand. But where would the money come from? Do you have any thoughts around how tax could maybe be restructured, or what we would need to do in order to have more money available? Or are there any other ideas how we could finance the actions that we need to take going forward?
Yeah, I think there's a number of dimensions of that. I mean, the government signaled that there's going to be a lot of money spent on climate change, and it's going to come through revenues from the emissions trading scheme. And that's really appropriate. It means that the polluters are paying for the investments those collective investments we all need to make in a low carbon future. I think that's entirely appropriate. In the bigger picture, investments that we're making in infrastructure, particularly green infrastructure, I think it's absolutely appropriate to do that through government borrowing, because those are long-term assets. They'll be there for 30 to 40 years. Borrowing is a way to ensure that the cost of that doesn't fall solely on current taxpayers. It's partly borne by future generations who will benefit from that infrastructure. Again, that's completely appropriate. But what we do also need a lot more of is revenue for day-to-day spending, for things like increasing benefits, for spending more on the health system, investing more in low decile schools, many of which are really struggling at the moment. And we suffer from a perennial shortfall in tax revenue in this country. You know, we take in something like 30% of GDP is tax. European nations like the Netherlands or Germany or Austria, never mind even the high taxing Scandinavians, would take in something like 38, 36, 40% of GDP. So they would, if they were the same size as us, they would have another $20 to $30 billion a year to play with compared to, or to put that a different way, if our government taxed like their government did, even allowing for the size of the New Zealand economy, our government would have $20 to $30 billion extra a year to spend. And so you wonder why often it feels like public services are a bit starved of resources, a bit threadbare in New Zealand. It's because they're operating on a really basic budget. And so we do need to really massively increase the tax take in a very fundamental sense. Where should that come from? Well, a lot of sources, but I think predominantly from taxing wealth and the kinds of income that wealthy people rely on, which are basically not taxed at all or hardly at the moment. So that's taxing capital gains, taxing inheritances, or just taxing wealth directly with an annual levy. Any combination of those, you could at least easily start to bring in $5 billion, $10 billion a year, start to redress that massive perennial underfunding of New Zealand public services.
Kind of related to that is, I guess, the recent announcement of government around the new limits that it has set itself on debt and borrowing. What are your thoughts around that? And can you briefly explain what they have done?
Yes, this all gets very complicated. And some people will remember that in opposition, Labour and the Greens signed up to the budget responsibility rules, which were rightly very controversial. And I thought those were very problematic because they permanently constrained government spending and tax gathering at about that 30% of GDP level, so miles below our European counterparts. The new ones that Grant Robertson has recently announced are a little bit better, I think. Essentially, he's saying that in normal times, governments should aim to run a small surplus. And I think that's reasonable. You should pay for your current spending out of your current income, just like, every other sort of organization does. But what he said in terms of government borrowing is he's replaced the old target of trying to get government borrowing down below 20% of GDP. Well, yeah, and instead set a ceiling up to which government debt can float, but there's no sort of sense of trying to always drive it down and set a target for it. And it's complicated. It's hard to explain because the accounting measure has just changed. But essentially, the new ceiling up to which government borrowing can float gives you room for about $90 billion more in government borrowing than the old target of getting it down to below 20% of GDP. I still think the limit they've set on borrowing is too low because it's a half to a third that of countries like the US and the UK. And although we might need to keep debt a little bit lower than them because we're a smaller, more vulnerable country, I still think it's far too low, and that's a political choice. Robertson is trying to be seen to be prudent on questions of borrowing, but it is an advance on the old budget responsibility rules. It's much less constraining than they were, but it is also a political move. And the other thing, of course, is that if Labour are saying, look, if re-elected, we will run surpluses on current spending every year, on spending on public services and health and education and benefits, that's really going to limit how much money they can spend on those things if they don't raise tax. And so you get right back to that problem that Labour isn't really willing to have a serious conversation with the electorate about tax, isn't willing to actually raise the taxation needed to fund better public services.
Yeah, thank you. I'm mindful of the time. So one last question, Max. Coming back to our original question, I would like to ask you what is needed actually to call the budget a budget that delivers for equality and for climate with an exclamation mark rather than a question mark. What is needed? Is there one thing, if you could add or include something in the budget or change something without, of course, knowing how it looks like, but what do you think are the, say, top priorities, one for equality and one for climate, that you would change or add?
I think it's things I've talked about already, probably. I think on the, at least in the short term, and we have to think of budgets as, often delivering things for the here and now. In the short term, some kind of payment that, goes to low-income families and that helps them bear the soaring cost of groceries and fuel and things like that. I think that's absolutely essential. That isn't a long-term solution for inequality, but I think that's the most important issue at the moment. On climate, again, I would come back to public transport because I think it's so important. And transport and urban form make up a huge chunk of our emissions. I mean, farming obviously is another one, but I don't think be surprised if the budget really gets into dealing with farming emissions. That's a separate and very complex and very controversial process. If you leave that farming bit aside for a moment, a huge amount of it is transport and urban form. And of course, those two things are connected anyway. The budget can't, sort of change planning rules and things like that in the short term, but it can do things around public transport, walking and cycling. So I think that's crucial. But I think the overarching point I would make is that, the value of that public spending has to be defended. There are things that only government can do. Only government can make those collective investments. I mean, what do we look for government to do? Abraham Lincoln, such a long time ago, said it. Government isn't there to do everything, but it's there to do things that individuals cannot do or cannot do so well for themselves. It's about building those pieces of collective infrastructure, which you could say includes the health system and the education system. Building that collective infrastructure, the public transport, the railways, the things that none of us could do by ourselves. That investment is absolutely essential. It isn't wasteful. It isn't going to contribute meaningfully to inflation, which is largely an imported problem. So, the line has to be sounded loud and clear that increased spending is really important to address the future, to address the problems we face and build the future we need.
Thank you so much for highlighting that strongly at the end. Wonderful. And we have a lot of unanswered questions actually here in the question and answer function. Sorry that we didn't get to all of the questions, but I'm sure Max will join us again another time to continue the discussion. And of course, please take the questions into the workplace, into your families, into the discussions with your friends. It's important that we talk about the budget and develop ideas on, where we need to invest to achieve the future that we want. So thank you so much, Max, for joining us again. It was an absolute pleasure. And from the vibrant chat as well, I think people took a lot out of it. So thank you very much. As I said at the beginning, this has been recorded, so it will be available. You can watch it at a later time. And I will close us off. No, one more thing. We have those two webinars that I mentioned at the very beginning. So one on the 18th of May on the climate, a plan for the climate. We'll be discussing that. And then another one after the budget on the 20th. And we will dissect the budget and actually discuss what's in it and I think what is missing and where the opportunities lie. So please join us again for those two webinars next week. Thank you everyone for coming. Thanks for making the time for it. And I'll hope to see you all next week. And now I will close us off with a whakatauki. And it goes like this. Naku te roro, nau te roro, ka ora ai te iwi. With your basket and my basket, we will sustain everyone. Thank you, everyone, and stay well.